Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Actuary podcast, produced on behalf of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the IFoA. I'm Jon Watkins, a financial journalist, and as ever, your host for this podcast. As usual, there are three great guests in this episode. We've got an expert in terrorism insurance, Tom Clementi. Then we're meeting Paul Lewis, the relatively new Chief Executive Officer of the IFoA. And we're chatting to a talented risk actuary in the form of Yasmeen Husain. First up then, here in the studio is Tom Clementi. He's the CEO of Paul Re, the UK's government-backed terrorism reinsurer. He was recently interviewed in the Actuary's May-June edition, and we look forward to exploring that in a bit more detail with Tom now. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Great to see you, John.
Thanks very much. So I mentioned there in my intro that Paul Re is a government-backed terrorism reinsurer, but can you in a nutshell explain exactly what that means and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So we are, as you said, we're a reinsurance company and we provide unlimited terrorism cover to our members. So any business that's authorized to conduct, UK commercial property insurance business is eligible to become a member. And if you become a member, and it's entirely your choice, if you become a member, then you'll get unlimited terrorism cover from Paul Re for a price. We don't provide, our service for free. But should our own funds prove to be insufficient to cover a loss, it have to be a pretty big loss, we do have a government guarantee. And that enables us to provide that unlimited cover. So we're a reinsurer. We're also a mutual. We're owned by our members, and we're also a public-private partnership, because of that government backstop. So we are, in fact, an arm's-length body of HM Treasury. So we're a number of things, but at heart, we're a terrorism reinsurer.
And terrorism's a interesting, fast-moving, evolving area. You think about terrorism back in the 90s, you think of things like, IRA and bombings and things like that. And then you think about terrorism today.
Yeah.
Very, very different. How do you keep up with that? And, such a evolving area.
Yeah. Well, we were set up in response to the IRA's mainland bombing campaign in the early 90s. Right. In fact, it was the Baltic Exchange bomb in April 92. Yeah. This is the day after John Major's surprise election victory. April 92, the following day, the Baltic Exchange bombing occurred. And in the wake of that bombing, the private market said, we're out. So the insurance and reinsurance industry said, look, the losses are, coming thick and fast. The uncertainty is untenable. There's no reliable methodology for, calculating an affordable price for this peril. We're out. So it was a market failure, and the government stepped in to set up a public-private partnership to address a risk which neither industry nor government could really deal with unilaterally. So that was back in the 90s, IRA. Of course, as you say, the threat has evolved quite considerably since then. And so the IRA, Irish Republican terrorism, has not completely disappeared, but it's faded away. And the predominant threat now is from Islamist extremists. We've also seeing an increase in right-wing extremism. And we've also seen, in particular in the last 5 or 6 years, a real increase in state threats. Mm-hmm. So the threat doesn't stand still, but nor does Paul Re. So we have evolved our cover as the threat has evolved. So back at the beginning of Paul Re in the early 90s, we were doing really fire and explosion. And then in the wake of 9/11, so that's 2001, we included chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear cover. And then more recently, we included cover for non-damage business interruption. So your business has not been damaged, but the police have thrown a cordon around, let's say, Borough Market. You can't access the premises, and you have losses as a result. So we cover non-damage BI if members choose to buy it. And we've also, again, fairly recently included cover for a remote digital trigger. So that's really the cyber part of what we do. It's quite limited in scope, but we have a sort of very sort of small sliver of cover there for cyber terrorism.
That evolution of terrorism, if you like, what challenges does that throw up for you as a business looking forward? It's moving faster than ever, it seems. And, you touched on cyber there being completely different to the sorts of things we were talking about from the 90s and even 9/11. So what challenges does that throw up for you as a business and the wider world, given this rapid pace of change?
Yeah, well, the challenge is, I guess, to your point, is to remain relevant. I mean, that's true of
Mhm.
pretty much any organization. So as the threat evolves, so too, should your cover. And I sort of spoke about the way that Pool Re's cover has evolved over the last 32 years or so. But we also have a challenge, really from government that's been there ever since the inception of Pool Re, to return more risk back to private market, because the more risk is taken by the private market, the less sits on the government's balance sheet, ultimately sitting with the taxpayer. And we have a pretty good record of returning risk to the private market by encouraging our members to retain more of the risk before it comes into the pool. But we also ourselves buy quite a big slug of reinsurance. We issue a terrorism catastrophe bond into the capital markets. It's the largest in the world. So there are means by which we can return risk into the private market to effectively insulate the taxpayer from loss. So that's the challenge. I think we've risen to that challenge. Yeah, but as you say, what does the future of terrorism hold? And I think that to date, we actually haven't seen an awful lot in the cyber terrorism space. Absolutely, states have the capacity and the resources to launch, material cyber attacks, and we've seen a bit of that. But so far, actually, cyber terrorism is quite an emotive term.
Mhm.
We haven't seen a huge amount of it because I think there's limited martyrdom in a cyber attack.
Right.
I think what terrorists want is, obviously I'm not speaking with any experience, but what terrorists are looking for is a visceral, eye-catching impact.
Right.
And sometimes it might be difficult to distinguish between, a cyber attack and just a bad IT day. And that's not really the effect that the terrorist wants. But I think a failure of imagination is a real risk here, right? It should be a risk on the risk register. And what is the art of the possible? There are all sorts of things one can imagine terrorists doing through cyber means. I mean, you look at, for instance, data centers. We've got more and more data centers around the UK. A lot of these data centers have quite rudimentary air conditioning systems. If there's some way of stopping the air conditioning system from working, the data center can overheat. You're then looking at fire risk, big fire, big data center, and what repercussions would that have? So I think in terms of cyber terrorism, I think the barriers to entry are probably going to come down. I worry about what quantum computing and artificial intelligence could mean. I'm concerned about the capacity for states to actually pass on some of their expertise and their resources to terrorist organizations that they may see as being friendly to their interests. I think also the insider threat is quite a worry. I mean, there was a Al-Qaeda operative who ended up working for British Airways IT department, and he was prosecuted back in 2010 as a matter of public record. Actually, at the time, he wasn't hell-bent on trying to bring down aircraft through a cyber attack. He was trying to, explain to his mates how to get a bomb on a plane. So yes, I think actually terrorism, particularly in the last few years, we've seen it on a fairly unsophisticated pathway. But I think that capacity for cyber terrorism is all there, and it's all to come potentially. Is a genuine concern.
You were interviewed in our May-June issue where you mentioned the difficulties around modelling for terrorism insurance. Fairly infrequent attacks mean that you don't have a lot of historic data to rely on to do your forward-looking modelling. So how do you do that? How do your actuaries manage that?
Well, we've got a fantastic actuarial team is the answer. You've got some very brainy and creative actuaries. So yeah, it's a good thing we haven't got lots of data, right? But it also makes it more challenging, right? And we're in the business of trying to price risk, which is hard to price, hard to model, hard to underwrite. So we're having to think about all sorts of scenarios, most of which have never happened, and attach frequency and severity assumptions to them. So there's a large degree of educated guesswork going on. So we work very closely with. Actually, we have an in-house team of threat experts called Pool Re Solutions. So they help to inform some of the assumptions that feed into the model. But we also work pretty closely with Cambridge University, with the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, which is a very eminent think tank on defence and security issues in London. So we work with academia, think tanks, and our own team to come up with those assumptions for many events which have never happened and I hope never will. But we have to we have to be alive to the possibility, right? As I say, failure of imagination is a risk that should sit squarely on our risk register.
Yeah, absolutely. Where does terrorism risk sit within the insurance industry? Is it very much treated like any other risk among the wider industry, or is it given its own specific weight given its nature?
Well, it's got some particular characteristics, but not necessarily unique. I mean, I think, thinking about the UK insurance market, particularly the London insurance market, which is more kind of where I'm from. I mean, it's an absolute centre of expertise internationally for dealing with sort of distressed, catastrophic risk, as well as lots of other risks. There is a thriving and highly expert political violence and terrorism market here in London, which writes terrorism, all over the world. I mean, Pool Re is really an adjunct to commercial property policies, so it's really commercial property insurers who become members of Pool Re and can provide Pool Re cover if their policyholders want it. So we sit really as an adjunct to, I suppose, the commercial property market. But I think that there's a thriving standalone political violence and terrorism market, which provides cover to businesses all around the world, and that's particularly centered around the Lloyd's market.
Right, it's heavy and complex stuff. Lightening the mood slightly, moving into a bit more about, I guess, about you and your background and what your interests. A lot of our TV these days are sort of built around these big events, that exactly the sort of terrorist events that your organisation might be covering or insuring against. Does that whet your appetite for that type of TV show, that sort of series? Do you engage with those a bit more because of that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm a big TV fan. Actually, I watch quite a lot of TV. But I don't think, yes, my work, my professional life detracts from my enjoyment of what I watch on screen. And I think I'm pretty good at disaggregating work from play. So no, I don't think it's affected my enjoyment or what I watch particularly. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, I was just thinking, there are quite a lot of TV programs that are pretty dark, aren't they?
Right.
It's quite hard to find the light. I was watching with my wife Colin from Accounts, which is quite nice. It's a short episodes and just quite upbeat and cheery. But more recently, we've been watching Mayor of Kingstown, which is quite gloomy and quite dark. Oh my God. I like to watch more comedy, but I think comedy's harder, really, and it's harder to do. So it's probably less a bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about you outside of your professional life? I understand that you have a role within the Royal Ballet School. I think you sit on its Finance and Audit Risk Committee. What's your connection with ballet, and what does that give you outside of work?
Well, I'm just a real fan of the arts in general. Theatre, ballet, opera, music. But I particularly like ballet and have done ever since I was taken to see Giselle, age 13. I love ballet, and I'm a big believer in volunteering. So I think all of us who work in financial services, but whatever sector you work in, we have all sorts of skills that can be of benefit to charities and not-for-profits. In fact, my wife runs a charity called Charterpath, which is all about people who work in finance or the accounting profession, using their skills to help charities. And for me, I'm a big believer in education, like most of us. So I've been a school governor for a while. So the Royal Ballet School is great because it allows me to combine my real interest in education with a passion for ballet. So, and I think actually, it in a way, it kind of, what I learn in the insurance or insurance world helps me be a school governor. What I learn as a school governor helps me be better at my day job. So I think there's a real crossover there, and I would really encourage people to think about volunteering and using their skills for charities, because you'll get a lot out of it. It's a complete win-win.
Oh, Tom, thanks so much for that walk through this really fascinating area of terrorism insurance and what that means for your organisation. Thanks for your time.
John, great pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Well, that was really interesting discussion around the issue of terrorism insurance. And if you'd like to learn a bit more about that, then you can do so by reading the interview with Tom in the May-June issue, or indeed online at theactuary.com. Next up, we welcome to our podcast Paul Lewis. He recently joined the IFoA as its CEO and is here to tell us more about himself and his role. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, John.
That's our pleasure. You've been in your newish role at IFoA for about 6 months now, started in January.
That's right.
For those that don't know you so well, tell us a little bit about your background and where you came from.
Yeah, prior to taking up the role in January, I spent the last 7 years or so at the Royal Society of Chemistry. It's a very similar organisation to the IFoA. It's around about 50 or so thousand members there. And I particularly was responsible as the Chief Operating Officer for overseeing the operations of the business, particularly our publishing operations. So it's £70 million or so turnover business with about 700 staff. So I was there for about 7 years, which was great experience for me. And certainly as a membership organisation helps me to prepare for the IFoA. And prior to that, I spent a number of years in a variety of roles, but all of them around education and training, so in educational assessment, as well as actually in delivering training as well and leading colleges and schools as well.
So lots of alignment with the IFoA. Tell us about your initial thoughts on the organisation since you've joined.
Yeah, it's a great organisation. At the heart of everything that we do are our members, and certainly over the last number of months, having that opportunity to meet with members, with employers, with the wider community that we serve. What strikes me as the enthusiasm is the real passion that they have for the actuarial sciences, but also with an eye to what the future will look like, so that actuaries who are now in their early stage of their career, what their careers will look like, and supporting that all the way through their lifelong career journey. So it's a really exciting time to be an actuary, but also particularly looking to the future, what the opportunities might be for those who are literally just thinking about that career.
Yeah, and 6 months into the role, I'm sure you've got an agenda of things that you're most focused on. Tell us a little bit about what that focus will be on and your sort of core priorities, I guess, for the next year or so.
Yeah, well, we're actually in the middle of a process of renewing our strategy. So we have a bridging strategy in place at the moment, but working with council very closely, they set a vision for what they see the IFA will be doing in the longer term. So I'm working with our board at the moment to set our strategic direction for the next 3 or 4 years. So that's a piece of work that's in progress. Certainly for me, where I'm looking even longer term than that is about thinking about the financial sustainability of the organisation, but also back to what I've just talked about with the members, making it relevant for the longer term for our membership so that we have in place the programmes, the support, the ways of working that will really encourage people to want to be an actuary, but also importantly to be a member of the IFoA all the way through their career. So there's some real opportunities there. So that's the focus at the moment. But if we can get that strategy in place, that will give us a really strong platform and foundation for the future.
Yeah, brilliant. And since you're here, I guess I've got to ask you about the recent situation with the student exams. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, firstly, I just need to say I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry for all the uncertainty that candidates and employers had to go through in preparing for our April examinations. The key for us is whatever we were going to do in April, it had to ensure the security, the integrity of our examinations over the longer term. And certainly with the issues that we had with our remote invigilation tool, we just couldn't go ahead in the way that we planned for our April sessions using that remote invigilation approach. So what we did quite quickly is to pivot to in-person invigilation. And we did that. I think, successfully, again, appreciating that that was difficult for employers and candidates as we were working through the plans that we had to put in place. Anecdotally, the feedback, and I actually attended quite a few exam sessions to see what was going on, is that candidates, I think, felt reassured by the process that we'd gone through, and particularly the in-person invigilation. So, we need to learn from that. There were big mistakes that were made and we need to get better for the future. But our plans certainly for September of this year and then going longer term is to use that hybrid approach of in-person exams. But we will also need to use remote invigilation from time to time, particularly for those candidates who can't get to a centre or for those who have special access arrangements. So lots of learning. I wish we hadn't had to go through that painful learning, but I do hope that over the longer term, it will provide the platform for a much better experience for students.
No, I appreciate you going over that. I'd like to learn a little bit more about you on the personal side as well, outside of work. What are you interested in? What sort of person are you?
Yeah, I alluded in my earlier answer to my passion for education and for training. And one thing I've just completed is an executive coaching qualification because I really believe in supporting others to achieve their potential. So if I got the opportunity to use that within the IFoA and the community, that would be fantastic to use that. Outside of sort of the more formal education sort of things that I enjoy doing, I've recently just started to try open water swimming. I dabbled with it a few years ago, bought the wetsuit and didn't really go too far with it. But I tried it not that long ago, and it was actually, quite good fun, if not a little cold. So perhaps when it warms up a little, you might find me splashing around in a lake near you.
That's great stuff. Well, Paul, listen, thanks so much for joining us and giving us a quick run through of your priorities over the next 12 months and how it feels to be settling into the role as Chief Executive Officer at IFoA.
That's very kind. Thank you, John. Good to talk.
Thanks for coming. So thank you to Paul for that. It was really good to meet him and learn a bit more about his role and his vision for the IFoA. Our final guest for this episode is a risk actuary, Yasmeen Husain. She's based in Scotland, but is today in Egypt and therefore dialing in from there to speak to us a bit about her career and her interests outside of being an actuary. Yasmeen, thank you for joining us. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's all great. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about your background. You were born in Egypt, raised in Bahrain, and when you qualified as a fellow in 2013, you were the first Bahraini ever to do so. There clearly weren't any role models for you to follow. So what gave you the drive to become an actuary?
Yes, that's absolutely right. When I have decided to become an actuary, when I put in my application for the master's degree in actuarial science, I had never talked to an actuary, never met an actuary, never knew what actually I was 24 when I heard the word actuary for the first time. All I knew was a description of the job. And to me, that was quite enough. I was working in insurance, but in underwriting. I was always very curious about, well, how do we decide that we are using this rate, for example, for this risk? Who makes this decision? It seems reasonable, but why? And that's when I found out what an actuary was, read about it, and it was, I think, a mixture of intellectual curiosity and the fact that I liked mathematics, and that it obviously is something that has quite a solid reputation with a tangible impact on the day-to-day lives, financial lives of normal human beings. So that was, to me, the driver. And I never really looked back. I really enjoyed my studies. They were very, very difficult to me because, well, let's put it this way. I studied mathematics in Arabic up until the point when I had to study actuarial exams. And always being an A student, it moved to me thinking, oh, I just want to pass this exam. So yes, it was the reputation of the profession that drove me to want to be an actuary. And I think it is absolutely a privilege. As you mentioned, I'm the first Bahraini to qualify as a fellow of the IFoA. I'm also the first Egyptian woman to qualify as a fellow of the IFoA. But to me, it's less of the distinction and more of the, I guess, opening doors to others who might feel that this is something that is quite difficult to achieve. So, no, it can be done. So yes, it is quite a privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned your studies there. You came to the UK to do a master's at Heriot Watt University in Edinburgh, and you've lived in the city ever since. So what led you to stay in Scotland and Edinburgh specifically?
Yes, well, it is very linked to the first question in that I have never met an actuary before I decided to become an actuary. And going back either to Bahrain or Egypt, well, Egypt, there were actuaries, but I still didn't know, I didn't know that. Let's me put it this way. I needed to be somewhere where I can learn the tools of my trade, especially that I have worked very hard to achieve the master's degree and to actually be in for a running with an actuarial career. So I needed to stay somewhere where I could learn the tools. It just so happened that the first job that I was able to get was in Scotland. But after that, of course, the world was my oyster, but I found that Scotland, especially Edinburgh, had a very good balance of it. It has a very vibrant it's a very vibrant financial hub, but at the same time, it is a relatively relaxed place to live. It had a good balance. It had culture. It still does. It's greenery, a very diverse space, very close to the Highlands. And I just fell in love with Edinburgh. It felt like home. I've in fact lived in Edinburgh longer than I've lived in my two home countries. So I've lived there longer than I've lived in Bahrain and longer than I've lived in Egypt.
Right.
Lived in the other two countries equal times.
After a long and varied career as a risk actuary, you recently took the plunge to launch your own consultancy, Optimize ERM. Tell us a bit about that and what you do.
Right. So there are a number of factors that contributed to me launching my own business. So first, I'm not necessarily a traditional actuary. So I am an actuary who works in the risk space most of the time. For the past 10 years before I launched my business, I was self-employed. And that meant I had different clients of different requirements and different problems and different solutions. They would either need me to implement a solution or think of a design of a solution, for example, or to validate what they are doing to give an opinion, a robust opinion. So it fit very well with how I like variety and diversity when it comes to the kind of work that I do. And also fit very well with how I think about myself as a roaming problem solver. That being said, I actually thought that the actuarial profession, what we do as actuaries, what we deliver, has great value outside of the traditional financial space. And I thought, well, I have more than 20 years of experience. I'm good at something. I can take that thing that I understand and try to apply it somewhere else where it can add value as well. And not to mention the market in which I was operating was slowing down slightly. And that's understandable. There have been so many transformations over the past decade or so that are now slowing down and embedding. So there is less of a need for independent, self-employed actuaries in my market. But there's still a need in the non-financial market. And that's when I thought, let me take what I'm good at and pivot into another area. And I'm actually doing some work for a national charity right now. Charities are not in the business of making money, but they need to be able to keep the money that they have and manage it well so that they can continue to fulfill their purpose, which is to serve humanity. So they need someone who is able to look at their risk profile and give them either advice or help them with strategies, or even just help them with the numbers, doing stress and scenario testing. What would happen if this happens in the environment in which you operate, for example? And in fact, what I'm doing for the charity right now would be similar to what I would have done for an insurance company under something called an ORSA, an own risk and solvency assessment. A similar principle, similar application. But different name and different framing and different perspective looking into it.
Yeah, it's a great example of how you can apply the skills of your actuarial roles into wider organisations and wider impact. You also recently adopted the new chartered actuary status. What are the benefits that you expect that to deliver for you?
I think the benefit, well, I'm still testing that. I'm still collecting data and then measuring it, and I'll be able to answer it appropriately perhaps in a year. But I think the biggest value for me of the chartered designation is the word chartered. Not everybody knows what an actuary is. In the financial sector, it will have a different kind of impact. In the non-financial sector, usually I need to first explain what it is that I do, why it's good for the potential client, and then why me. But for them, the word actuary is less relevant than the word chartered. The word chartered implies professionalism, and it talks about standards, particularly a code of conduct, and some kind of commitment to your profession. So the word chartered, I think, does not necessarily open doors, but it definitely gives a level of comfort until then the new subset of population that I'm dealing with becomes more accustomed with what kind of value that we do.
You also volunteer with the IFoA Foundation's Aspiring Actuaries program, giving online group mentoring to graduates from around the world. Tell us a little bit about who you're working with through that and why it's an important role for you.
Right. Well, I will start by saying why it's important, or what attracted me the most to the IFoA Foundation, if that's all right. And for me, that was the international reach. Students in different countries have different levels of support, and also different levels of apprehension about whether or not they can make it. So, for example, I am lucky that I have qualified in the UK, where you have support from the employer in terms of either paying for your materials or for your exams or for tutorials and webinars or so on, or even just working in a building or a room and you're surrounded by tens of actuaries that you can ask a question. I had 2 managers who used to mock exam papers for me. They didn't have to do that. That was their time and their efforts. I completely appreciated that. So I'm very lucky that I qualified here. A lot of students in other countries do not have that kind of support and have significant self-doubt about whether or not they can make it. And the students that I have, and that's why I was attracted to the IFA Foundation. And the students that I have mentored so far as part of the group mentoring, they come from different parts of the world, from the Middle East, where I originally hail from Africa, from Asia. And I do maintain these relationships with them after their cohort finishes. So I have some students and I have, catch-ups with them every couple of months. So they can tell me a little bit about their progression and the challenges that they're having and so on. But I think for the students, what has been very valuable, I think for them and for me as well, is that they would listen to an actuary talking to them. And something in what they say resonates with them. And that thing that resonates with them is what can empower them.
Clearly inspiring different people in different ways. And thank you for that walk through your career to date as well. It's very interesting. We like to wrap up on a slightly lighter note and learn a little bit more about what you like to do outside of your work. And you have an interesting, slightly unusual hobby outside of work of making stringed instruments. Tell us a little bit about how difficult that is and what you might be working on at the moment.
It is very difficult, but I think you can probably tell that I do like a challenge. It's very difficult, and it should be, because you're taking a piece of wood and you're making it sing. So it requires it's actually part science and part art, and that is something that is very appealing to me. Right now, I'm working on my second guitar. However, I have not picked up any of my tools in months. But that is more to do with the fact that I have been slightly focused on setting up my business and all the admin and life admin that comes with that. But apart from my build, I'm actually fixing a friend's guitar, which actually came at the perfect timing. She just sent me a message a couple of weeks ago with a picture of a guitar where something went wrong, and she said what happened. And I was absolutely thrilled that I was able to venture into that part of my hobby in a very busy time, telling her all the different reasons why it could have happened, and then ask her if she would be okay with me fixing it for her. So on my bench, once I get back to the UK, because I am in Egypt these days, once I get back to the UK, on my bench would be my friend's Fender acoustic that has a bridge that had become completely unglued. And I'm going to be building a bridge for her guitar, making it sing again.
Brilliant. Well, I hope the continued setup of your business goes smoothly and you can get back to that hobby as soon as possible. Yasmeen, thanks so much for sharing your story with us. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Jon. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much to Yasmeen, and indeed to all of our guests on this episode of the Actuary podcast. We hope, as always, that you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed pulling it together. Do join us again for our next episode coming out after the July-August issue of the magazine, and I look forward to seeing you then.